The conference room fell silent as Malcolm Brenner, my boss and the vice president of operations at Sterling Tech Solutions, slammed his hand on the table. His face was red with rage, and his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. I just finished presenting my quarterly report, detailing a process improvement initiative I'd implemented that had saved the company over $300,000 in operational costs. The numbers were solid, the results undeniable, but Malcolm was furious. "This is the most irresponsible, unauthorized initiative I've ever seen," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Cassandra, you went completely outside your authority, implementing changes without approval, disrupting established workflows, and creating chaos across multiple departments." I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up his hand to silence me. "I don't want to hear excuses. What you did was insubordinate and unprofessional. You cost this company resources and credibility with our vendors." The accusation was absurd. My initiative had saved money, improved efficiency, and received enthusiastic support from the teams affected by the changes. But Malcolm was rewriting the narrative, framing my success as failure in front of senior leadership and my colleagues. "The data shows significant cost savings and improved metrics," I said carefully, keeping my voice professional despite my racing heart. "Every department involved has reported positive outcomes." Malcolm laughed, a harsh sound that made several people in the room wince. "Positive outcomes? You disrupted contracts with long-standing vendors without consulting anyone. You implemented software changes that violated our security protocols. And you did all of this behind my back because you knew I'd never approve such reckless proposals." Each accusation was false. I'd followed proper channels, documented every approval, worked within established security guidelines, and kept Malcolm informed through weekly status reports he'd apparently never read. But contradicting him publicly would only make things worse, I realized. This wasn't about facts or performance. This was about power and control. "Your initiative is shut down effective immediately," Malcolm continued. "You'll spend the next month reversing all changes you made and restoring our previous systems. Consider yourself lucky you're not being terminated for gross insubordination." I sat down, my face burning with humiliation as colleagues avoided making eye contact. The meeting continued with other agenda items, but I barely heard any of it. My mind was racing, processing what had just happened and what it meant for my career. After the meeting, I returned to my desk in a daze. Several colleagues stopped by with sympathetic looks and whispered support, but no one had defended me during Malcolm's tirade. They'd all sat silently, watching me be publicly humiliated, protecting their own positions rather than speaking truth to power. I understood their silence. Malcolm had a reputation for vindictiveness toward anyone who challenged him. Cross him publicly, and you'd find yourself sidelined, passed over for promotions, eventually pushed out of the company through subtle but systematic undermining. I'd watched it happen to others. I just never thought I'd become his next target. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing documentation from my improvement initiative. Every approval was properly obtained and documented. Every change was implemented within established guidelines. Every metric showed positive results. Malcolm's accusations weren't just wrong, they were deliberately fabricated. The question was why? What had I done to become his target? As I reviewed emails and meeting notes, a pattern emerged. 3 months ago, I'd been approached by the CEO's office about a potential promotion to Director of Process Optimization, a newly created position reporting directly to the Chief Operating Officer. The promotion would have moved me out of Malcolm's department entirely, giving me broader authority and visibility at the executive level. I'd had 2 preliminary conversations with the COO and had been told the formal offer would come after I completed my current project, the very initiative Malcolm had just shut down. Understanding dawned with cold clarity. Malcolm knew about the potential promotion. He'd seen it as a threat, evidence that leadership valued my work and vision more than his management. So he'd sabotaged me publicly, destroyed my credibility, and shut down the project that was supposed to demonstrate my readiness for director-level responsibility. It was calculated and effective. By framing my successful initiative as unauthorized chaos, he'd poisoned my reputation with the senior leadership who'd been considering promoting me. The promotion that had seemed certain 3 months ago now seemed impossible. I could fight back, I realized. I could present my documentation to HR, to the COO, to anyone who would listen. I could prove Malcolm's accusations were false and demand accountability for his public sabotage. But that approach was risky. Malcolm had been with Sterling Tech for 15 years, had powerful allies, and controlled the narrative through his position and relationships. A direct challenge might backfire, making me look like a vindictive employee unable to accept criticism. I needed a different strategy, something more subtle and devastatingly effective. I needed to make Malcolm destroy himself while I stayed above reproach. And I knew exactly how to do it. Over the next week, I documented everything meticulously. Every email, every approval, every metric from my improvement initiative. I created a comprehensive dossier, proving that Malcolm's accusations were false, that he'd been regularly informed of my work, and that his claims about vendor disruption and security violations were fabricated. But I didn't share this documentation with anyone. Not yet. Instead, I began implementing Malcolm's order to reverse my improvements and restore the old systems. I did it carefully, methodically, documenting every step and the consequences of returning to less efficient processes. Within 2 weeks, operational costs had increased by $40,000. Within a month, they'd increased by $75,000. The metrics that had improved under my initiative, processing time, error rates, customer satisfaction, all began declining back toward their previous problematic levels. I documented all of it, creating clear comparisons between the improved metrics under my system and the deteriorating metrics after Malcolm forced the rollback. I also started gathering information about Malcolm's management more broadly. I talked to colleagues in other departments, asking questions about their experiences with his leadership. What I discovered was illuminating. Malcolm had a pattern of taking credit for his employees' work while blaming them for his own failures. Several people shared stories similar to mine, successful projects that Malcolm had either claimed credit for or, if he couldn't take credit, sabotaged to prevent the employee from gaining recognition he felt threatened by. One former colleague, Thomas, had left Sterling Tech 6 months ago after Malcolm systematically undermined a successful product launch Thomas had led. He couldn't stand that I'd succeeded, Thomas told me over coffee. So he rewrote the narrative, convinced leadership the launch had actually failed, and got me reassigned to a dead-end role until I finally quit. Did you ever report his behavior? I asked. Thomas shook his head. I tried. But Malcolm's good at covering his tracks, and he's been here so long he has allies everywhere. HR basically told me it was my word against his and suggested I might be better suited for a different role if I couldn't work effectively with my manager. The system protected Malcolm, I realized. He'd built enough political capital and cultivated enough allies that challenging him directly was ineffective. Anyone who tried ended up isolated and eventually pushed out. But there had to be a weakness, some way to expose his pattern without becoming another casualty of his vindictiveness. The answer came from an unexpected source. During a casual conversation with someone from finance, I learned that Malcolm's department consistently ran over budget despite his claims of fiscal responsibility. We've been flagging discrepancies for months, the finance analyst confided. Expenses that don't match reported activities, vendor payments that seem excessive, travel costs that are unusually high. But Malcolm always has explanations, and no one wants to push too hard because he's protected. Protected, but not invulnerable. If there were financial irregularities, that was something that couldn't be dismissed as personality conflicts or management-style disagreements. That was potentially fraud, and the company would have to investigate regardless of Malcolm's political connections. I began researching Sterling Tech's ethics reporting system. The company had an anonymous hotline for reporting concerns about fraud, harassment, or ethics violations. Reports were handled by an external firm, not internal HR, specifically to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. I spent 2 weeks compiling a comprehensive report. I documented Malcolm's pattern of taking credit for employees' work and sabotaging those he viewed as threats, including specific examples with dates and corroborating witnesses. I included information about the financial irregularities the finance team had flagged, and I attached my own documentation proving his accusations against me were false. Most importantly, I framed everything in terms of risk to the company rather than personal grievance. Malcolm's behavior created legal liability, financial losses, and operational dysfunction. This wasn't about him being a bad boss. It was about him being a liability the company couldn't afford. I submitted the report anonymously through the ethics hotline on a Friday evening. Then I waited, continuing to document the deteriorating metrics from reversing my improvement initiative while maintaining perfect professional demeanor. 2 weeks later, Malcolm called a department meeting. He looked stressed, his usual confident swagger replaced with something more defensive. "I'm sure you've all heard rumors," he began without preamble. "The company is conducting an internal review of our department's operations and finances. This is standard procedure, nothing to be concerned about. However, I expect everyone's full cooperation with any inquiries." He looked directly at me when he said this, and I wondered if he suspected I'd been involved in triggering the review. But I maintained a neutral expression, giving nothing away. "Continue your excellent work," Malcolm concluded. "And remember, loyalty to this department and to your colleagues is paramount. We're a team, and teams protect each other." The implied threat was clear. Don't talk to investigators. Don't share information that might reflect poorly on the department or its leadership. Maintain the facade that everything was fine. Over the next month, investigators from the external ethics firm interviewed employees across the department. When they spoke to me, I was honest but measured, presenting facts and documentation without editorializing or expressing personal grievances. I showed them the comprehensive records I'd kept of my improvement initiative. The approvals, the metrics, the communications with Malcolm. I explained how he'd ordered it reversed despite its success. And I showed them the deteriorating performance metrics that had resulted from the rollback. "Did you feel Mr. Brenner's characterization of your initiative as unauthorized and chaotic was accurate?" the investigator asked. "No," I replied simply. "The documentation shows I followed proper approval processes and kept him informed throughout. The metrics demonstrate the initiative was successful, not chaotic." The investigator made notes and moved on to other questions about departmental operations, budgets, and Malcolm's management style. I answered everything honestly, providing facts without emotional commentary. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Malcolm was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. His second-in-command, a competent but politically neutral manager named Patricia, took over department leadership temporarily. The atmosphere in the office shifted immediately. People spoke more openly, collaborated more freely, stopped carefully managing their words and actions to avoid Malcolm's unpredictable reactions. It was like a collective exhale, the release of tension everyone had been carrying. Patricia called me into her office 2 days after taking over interim leadership. "I've reviewed your improvement initiative," she said without preamble. "The one Malcolm ordered you to reverse. The documentation is impressive, and the results were clearly positive. Why did he shut it down?" "You'd have to ask him," I replied carefully. Patricia gave me a knowing look. "I'm asking you." I considered how much to share, then decided honesty was appropriate. I believe Malcolm felt threatened by the initiative's success and the recognition it was bringing me. There had been conversations about a potential promotion that would have moved me out of his department. I think he viewed shutting down my project as a way to prevent that promotion. Patricia nodded slowly. That aligns with other information that's emerged during the investigation. "Cassandra, I want to reinstate your improvement initiative effective immediately. Can you implement it again?" "Yes," I said. "I have all the documentation and can restore the systems within 2 weeks." "Do it," Patricia said, "and keep me informed of progress. I want weekly status reports and full transparency about any challenges you encounter." Over the next month, I re-implemented my improvement initiative with Patricia's full support. This time, I made sure to communicate broadly, ensuring everyone in leadership understood what I was doing and why. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within 3 weeks, operational costs had decreased by $90,000 compared to the inflated costs under the old system Malcolm had forced me to restore. Processing times improved, error rates declined, customer satisfaction scores increased. Every metric demonstrated the value of the improvements I'd implemented. Meanwhile, the investigation into Malcolm continued. The ethics firm's review had expanded beyond just my concerns to examine patterns across his 15-year tenure at Sterling Tech. What they found was damning. Malcolm had systematically taken credit for employees' successful projects while blaming them for his own failures. He'd sabotaged multiple high-performing employees who he viewed as threats to his position. And most significantly, he'd engaged in financial misconduct, inflating expense reports, receiving kickbacks from vendors in exchange for favorable contracts, and misappropriating departmental funds for personal use. The financial irregularities alone totaled over $200,000 across 3 years. Combined with the documented pattern of employee abuse and the operational dysfunction his mismanagement had created, the evidence was overwhelming. 6 weeks after being placed on administrative leave, Malcolm was terminated for cause. The announcement came via company-wide email from the CEO, unusually transparent about the reasons for his departure. Sterling Tech is committed to ethical leadership and operational excellence, the email stated. Recent investigations revealed conduct inconsistent with these values. We've terminated the individual responsible and are implementing additional oversight to ensure such issues don't occur again. Malcolm was gone. His 15-year career at Sterling Tech ended in disgrace. But the consequences extended beyond just his termination. The investigation had revealed systemic problems in how the company handled employee complaints and monitored managerial conduct. HR implemented new policies for reporting concerns, new training for managers on ethical leadership, and new accountability measures for department-level budgets and performance. My role in triggering the investigation remained officially anonymous, though several colleagues suspected I'd been involved based on the timing and the specific issues examined. But because I'd used the anonymous ethics hotline and had never publicly accused Malcolm, I was protected from any appearance of vindictiveness or score settling. I'd simply reported legitimate concerns through proper channels, and the investigation had uncovered problems far more extensive than my individual grievance. 2 months after Malcolm's termination, I was called to a meeting with the COO, the same executive who'd discussed a potential promotion with me months earlier before Malcolm had sabotaged my prospects. "Cassandra," she began, "I want to apologize. We were aware you were being considered for a director-level position when Malcolm publicly criticized your improvement initiative. We should have investigated his accusations more thoroughly before allowing them to derail your promotion prospects." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. The COO continued, "The director position we discussed previously is still available. In fact, given everything that's emerged about Malcolm's management and your consistent performance despite his sabotage, we'd like to offer you an expanded role, Senior Director of Process Optimization and Efficiency, reporting directly to me." The promotion was more than I'd originally been offered. Senior Director was a significant jump, with broader authority, higher compensation, and direct access to executive leadership. "There's another component to this offer," the COO added. "We need someone to review operational practices across the entire company, identifying inefficiencies and implementing improvements similar to what you did in Malcolm's former department. We're creating a dedicated team of 6 people who will report to you. You'd have budget authority and the mandate to make substantial changes where needed." It was an extraordinary opportunity, far beyond what I'd hoped for when I first reported Malcolm's behavior. Not only was I being promoted, I was being given resources and authority to transform operations across the company. "I accept," I said without hesitation. The transition to my new role happened quickly. I moved to an office near the executive suite, assembled my team of analysts and project managers, and began conducting a comprehensive operational review across Sterling Tech's various departments. What I found was both exciting and troubling. There were inefficiencies everywhere. Redundant processes, outdated systems, communication breakdowns that cost time and money. But there were also pockets of excellence. Teams doing innovative work that deserved recognition and could be scaled across the company. Over the next 6 months, I implemented improvements that saved Sterling Tech over $1.5 million in operational costs while improving service delivery and employee satisfaction. The success attracted attention not just within Sterling Tech, but across the industry. I was invited to speak at conferences, write articles for business publications, and serve on advisory boards for professional organizations. My career, which Malcolm had tried to destroy, was flourishing beyond anything I'd imagined. But success brought its own challenges. Some colleagues resented my rapid advancement, particularly people who'd worked at Sterling Tech longer but had never achieved similar recognition. There were whispers that I'd only been promoted because I'd taken down Malcolm, that my success was more about political maneuvering than actual competence. I addressed these perceptions directly in a department-wide meeting where I presented the data behind our improvements. Some people believe my promotion was about politics, I said. But the numbers tell a different story. Our initiatives have saved the company $1.5 million, improved customer satisfaction by 18%, and reduced processing times by 23% across multiple departments. I pulled up slides showing specific improvements, the teams who'd implemented them, and the measurable results. This isn't about me taking credit or advancing through manipulation. This is about teams across Sterling Tech doing excellent work that deserves recognition. My job is to identify that work, remove barriers to success, and scale effective practices across the company. The presentation seemed to shift perceptions. People saw the concrete results, understood the collaborative nature of the improvements, and recognized that my success was built on elevating others' work rather than claiming individual credit. A year after Malcolm's termination, Sterling Tech promoted me again, this time to Vice President of Operations, the same position Malcolm had held when he tried to destroy my career. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, particularly those who remembered Malcolm's public humiliation of me in that conference room meeting. I was now sitting in his old office, with his old title, but with a completely different leadership approach. I held my first department meeting as vice president on a Monday morning, standing at the front of the same conference room where Malcolm had attacked me. Many of the same people who'd witnessed my humiliation were present, though some had moved to different roles and new faces had joined the team. I want to start by acknowledging history, I began. Many of you were present when my former boss publicly humiliated me in this room, falsely accusing me of unauthorized work and shutting down a successful initiative. That was a defining moment, but not in the way he intended. I paused, making eye contact around the room. It taught me that leadership isn't about protecting your ego or maintaining power through intimidation. It's about enabling your team's success, removing barriers to their work, and ensuring they receive recognition for their contributions. I outlined my vision for the department: collaborative, data-driven, focused on measurable results and continuous improvement. I established clear expectations: transparency, accountability, respect, and recognition of team contributions. I will never take credit for your work, I said firmly. When you succeed, I'll make sure leadership knows who actually did the work. And if I disagree with your approach, I'll discuss it with you privately and professionally, not humiliate you publicly to assert dominance. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People who'd been guarded and cautious under Malcolm's leadership began proposing ideas, taking initiative, collaborating across teams. Productivity increased, innovation flourished, and the department's reputation within Sterling Tech transformed from dysfunction under Malcolm to excellence under my leadership. But not everyone was pleased with my success. Gerald Whitmore, a senior vice president who'd been one of Malcolm's closest allies, made his displeasure clear during an executive leadership meeting 3 months after my promotion. "I'm concerned about the pace of change in operations," Gerald said, looking directly at me. "We're disrupting established practices, alienating long-standing vendors, and creating instability across departments." It was almost exactly what Malcolm had said about my improvement initiative, and I recognized immediately what Gerald was doing, trying to replicate Malcolm's sabotage strategy, framing my success as reckless disruption. But I was prepared this time. "The data shows otherwise," I replied calmly, pulling up metrics on the conference room screen. "Operational costs are down $2.3 million year over year. Customer satisfaction is at the highest level in company history. Employee engagement in operations has increased by 27%, and we've strengthened vendor relationships by implementing transparent bidding processes and performance accountability." I showed specific examples of vendors who'd improved service quality under the new system, cost savings from competitive bidding, and employee feedback about improved workplace culture. "If by disrupting established practices you mean replacing inefficiency with effectiveness," I continued, "then yes, we're absolutely disrupting. But the results demonstrate this is beneficial disruption, not destabilization." Gerald's face reddened, but he had no effective counter-argument to data-driven results. The CEO, who'd been watching the exchange, spoke up. "Cassandra's results speak for themselves. Operations has transformed under her leadership from one of our most problematic departments to one of our highest performing. Gerald, unless you have specific concerns supported by data, I think we should celebrate this success rather than questioning it." Gerald backed down, but I'd made an enemy. He'd tried to replicate Malcolm's strategy, and I'd neutralized it with preparation and data. Now he'd likely view me as a threat, someone who needed to be undermined or removed. I mentioned the interaction to Patricia, who'd become a trusted colleague and ally after serving as interim department head during Malcolm's suspension. "Gerald's dangerous," Patricia warned. "He's more politically sophisticated than Malcolm was, and he has deeper relationships across the company. If he's decided you're a threat, you need to be careful." "What should I do?" I asked. Patricia considered the question. "Document everything, build alliances, make sure your results are so visible and undeniable that any attempt to undermine you looks like sour grapes rather than legitimate concern." Over the next 6 months, I did exactly that. I cultivated relationships with other executives, made sure my team's achievements were regularly communicated to leadership, and maintained meticulous documentation of our work and results. I also started mentoring other employees who showed potential but lacked visibility or opportunities for advancement. If Gerald tried to isolate me, I wanted to make sure I had allies at multiple levels of the organization. The strategy proved necessary. Gerald began a subtle campaign to undermine me, questioning my decisions in meetings, suggesting my approach was too aggressive, hinting that my rapid advancement was due to factors other than performance. But each time he raised concerns, I had data refuting them. When he claimed I was alienating vendors, I showed improved vendor satisfaction scores. When he suggested my changes were too expensive, I demonstrated millions in cost savings. When he implied employee morale was suffering, I presented engagement surveys showing dramatic improvements. Gerald's attacks became increasingly desperate and obviously personal rather than substantive. Other executives began noticing the pattern, and several privately expressed support for my leadership while noting Gerald's behavior seemed vindictive. 18 months after Malcolm's termination, the CEO announced her retirement. The board of directors launched a search for her replacement, looking both internally and externally for candidates with the vision and capability to lead Sterling Tech through its next phase of growth. I was surprised when the board invited me to interview for the position. At 38, I'd be young for a CEO role, and my background in operations rather than sales or product development wasn't the traditional path to executive leadership. But the board was impressed by the transformation I'd led in operations and wanted to explore whether that success could be scaled across the entire organization. "Your results are impressive," the board chair told me during my initial interview. "You've demonstrated the ability to identify problems, implement solutions, and lead organizational change. Those are exactly the capabilities we need in our next CEO." The interview process was rigorous. Multiple rounds with board members, presentations on strategic vision, discussions of competitive positioning and growth opportunities. I was competing against two external candidates with traditional CEO pedigrees and stronger name recognition in the industry. I didn't expect to get the position, honestly. But I wanted to be taken seriously as a candidate to demonstrate I could think strategically at that level, even if this particular opportunity didn't work out. The final interview was with the full board of directors. They asked me to present my vision for Sterling Tech's future, and I laid out a comprehensive strategy focused on operational excellence, customer centricity, and employee empowerment. We've been treating operations, sales, and product development as separate silos, I explained, but our most successful initiatives have come from breaking down those barriers and creating cross-functional collaboration. I showed examples from my work in operations, projects that succeeded because we'd engaged sales and product teams early, incorporated customer feedback into process design, and given employees at all levels authority to solve problems rather than requiring approval through multiple management layers. As CEO, I'd scale that approach across the entire company, I concluded. Empowering teams, removing bureaucratic barriers, focusing relentlessly on measurable results, we'd become faster, more innovative, and more responsive to market changes than our competitors. 3 weeks after my final interview, the board chair called with news. Cassandra, the board has completed our deliberations. We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Tech Solutions. I was stunned into momentary silence. They'd actually chosen me over the external candidates with decades more experience. The board was unanimous, the chair continued. Your track record of transformation, your vision for the company's future, and your demonstrated leadership made you the clear choice. We believe you're exactly what Sterling Tech needs. I accepted immediately, and the announcement was made the following week. The response was overwhelmingly positive from employees, who saw my promotion as validation that performance and results mattered more than politics or tenure. But Gerald Whitmore's response was predictable. He resigned 2 days after my appointment was announced, apparently unwilling to work for someone he'd tried unsuccessfully to undermine. His departure was barely noticed. He'd become increasingly isolated as his attempts to sabotage me had backfired, and most people were relieved to see him go. My first day as CEO, I walked through Sterling Tech's offices, stopping to talk with employees at all levels. I wanted them to understand that despite my new title, I hadn't forgotten where I'd come from, or the challenges they faced daily. 2 years ago, I was publicly humiliated by my boss in a conference room down the hall. I told a group of junior employees during an impromptu meeting. He tried to destroy my career because he felt threatened by my success. It would have been easy to quit, to accept his narrative about my work, to decide fighting back was too risky. I paused, making sure they heard what came next. But I stayed silent in that moment, not because I accepted his lies, but because I was strategic about how to respond. I documented the truth, reported legitimate concerns through proper channels, and let the evidence speak for itself. That's what gave me control, not fighting on his terms, but changing the terms entirely. The story resonated, particularly with employees who'd felt powerless in their own situations. They saw a path forward that didn't require either passive acceptance or career-destroying confrontation. A third option, based on preparation, patience, and strategic action. Over my first year as CEO, I implemented the vision I'd outlined during board interviews. We broke down organizational silos, empowered cross-functional teams, removed bureaucratic barriers, and focused intensely on measurable results and customer satisfaction. The transformation wasn't easy. Some long-tenured employees resisted change, comfortable with familiar processes, even if they were inefficient. Some managers struggled with the shift from command and control leadership to empowerment and accountability. But gradually, the culture shifted. Teams began collaborating more effectively. Innovation accelerated as people felt safe proposing new ideas without fear of humiliation or career consequences. Customer satisfaction improved as we became more responsive to their needs. And financial results reflected the transformation. Sterling Tech's revenue grew by 18% in my first year as CEO, while operational costs declined by 11%. We'd become more profitable and more competitive simultaneously. Industry publications took notice. featuring Sterling Tech as a case study in organizational transformation. I was invited to speak at major conferences, interviewed by business journalists, recognized as one of the most successful young CEOs in the technology sector. But the recognition that meant most to me came from employees. In our annual engagement survey, 92% of employees rated leadership favorably. A dramatic increase from the 54% approval Malcolm's department had received before his termination. 3 years after Malcolm humiliated me in that conference room meeting, I stood in the same room addressing the company at our annual all-hands meeting. Many of the same people who'd witnessed my humiliation were present, though now as employees of a company I led, rather than as silent witnesses to a power play. I want to talk about that day 3 years ago. I began, acknowledging the history directly. The day my former boss publicly accused me of unauthorized work, shut down my successful initiative, and tried to destroy my career because he felt threatened by my accomplishments. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. In that moment, I had choices. I could have fought back immediately, defended myself publicly, made that meeting about my grievances against him. That would have felt satisfying, but would have been strategically foolish. It would have made the situation about interpersonal conflict rather than about the actual issues with his leadership. I paused, letting that sink in. Instead, I stayed silent, not because I accepted his lies, but because I was gathering power. I documented the truth. I reported legitimate concerns through proper channels. I let his own misconduct expose itself while I focused on producing undeniable results. I pulled up a slide showing the transformation since that day. The cost savings, the improved metrics, the expanded team, the promotions, and ultimately my appointment as CEO. This is what taking control looks like, I said. Not reactive defensiveness or public confrontation, but strategic action based on preparation, patience, and letting results speak louder than accusations. I looked around the room at faces showing recognition and understanding. Many of you have faced similar situations. Bosses who felt threatened by your competence, colleagues who took credit for your work, systems that seemed designed to protect the powerful rather than reward the capable. I leaned forward, making sure they understood what came next. You have more power than you think. Document everything. Report legitimate concerns through proper channels. Focus on producing undeniable results. And understand that silence in a moment of humiliation isn't weakness. It's strategy when you're preparing to take control. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of employees approached me afterward, sharing their own stories of facing similar challenges and asking advice about how to navigate them. I made sure my leadership team understood that supporting employees in these situations was a priority. We strengthened our ethics reporting systems, improved protection for whistleblowers, and created clearer paths for employees to raise concerns without career consequences. We also implemented new policies explicitly prohibiting the kind of credit stealing and public humiliation Malcolm had specialized in. Managers were evaluated not just on their team's results, but on how they developed talent, shared credit, and created psychologically safe environments where people could challenge ideas without fearing retaliation. The cultural transformation extended beyond just my personal story. Sterling Tech became known as a company where talent was recognized and rewarded, regardless of tenure or political connections, where problems were addressed through transparent processes rather than political maneuvering, where results mattered more than protecting egos. 5 years after Malcolm humiliated me in that conference room, Sterling Tech had tripled in value. We'd acquired 2 smaller competitors, expanded into new markets, and established ourselves as an industry leader in operational excellence and organizational culture. And Malcolm? I'd heard through the industry grapevine that he'd struggled to find another executive position after being terminated for cause from Sterling Tech. The financial misconduct and pattern of employee abuse had followed him, limiting his options. He'd eventually taken a mid-level management role at a small firm, a significant step down from the vice president position he'd held and abused. I occasionally thought about that day in the conference room, about the humiliation and rage I'd felt as Malcolm publicly attacked me while colleagues sat silently. But mostly, I thought about the strategic decision I'd made in that moment, to stay silent not out of weakness, but as preparation for taking control. That silence had given me space to think rather than react, to document rather than defend, to plan rather than panic. It had allowed me to respond strategically instead of emotionally, to change the terms of the conflict rather than fighting on his terms. Malcolm had tried to humiliate me into submission, to destroy my career before I could threaten his position. Instead, he'd created the catalyst that ultimately gave me his job, and then the entire company. The humiliation he'd intended as an ending became the beginning of something far bigger than he'd feared. I stood at the window of my CEO office, looking out over the city, reflecting on the journey from that conference room to this position. My boss humiliated me in a meeting. I stayed silent, gathering power and preparing my response. Then I took control. Not through confrontation or revenge, but through strategic action that exposed his misconduct while demonstrating my capabilities. He'd thought silence meant weakness. He'd been catastrophically wrong, and that misunderstanding had cost him everything while giving me everything. The lesson, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about understanding that power isn't always loud, that strength sometimes looks like patience, and that taking control often requires the wisdom to stay silent until you're truly ready to speak. Malcolm had humiliated me, but I'd had the last word, not by shouting louder, but by building something undeniable while he destroyed himself. That was control, that was power, and that was justice.